Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. I have a special thanks today for our latest on patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We have Eugene at the Alexandria level. Thank you so much, Eugene, for choosing to support the History of the Papacy. I would also like to send out a very special thank you to another new patron on Patreon, Dr. Depresso. Thank you so much. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, Brian, William R., Christina, Judy, Alec, and Eugene at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, Geoffrey the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, here is the next piece in the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Revelation 2:4. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to the idols and committed sexual immorality. Likewise, you have also those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Revelation 2:14-16. Not once, but twice we get mentions in the book of Revelation, a group called the Nicolaitans, the followers of Nicolaus of Pergamum. Nick ain't no saint, but he was a really fascinating character with some interesting things to say in the very earliest days of Christianity. So much so, he got called out not once, but twice in the book of Revelations, as we see. This is no small accomplishment. Let's find out more about this lesser known, but still really important character in the story of the early church. Why don't we start out first by doing some world building and build the setting of where Nicolaus fits into the Church of Asia Minor, one of the first jumping off points for the earliest of Christianity. He was from Pergamum, or he lived at least in Pergamum. We'll get into that, or Pergamon, a fascinating place in both the history of the world and of Christianity. It was a Hellenistic city of vast wealth based on trading, like most of the major cities of Asia Minor, including Ephesus, Smyrna, Laodicea, and many others. These cities were very Greek and had been very Greek for a very long time. And they would honestly be very Greek until the early 20th century, when there was forced population exchanges between Greece and Turkey. Greeks from the modern state of Turkey were compelled to move to Greece, and Turks, ethnic Turks from the state of Greece, were forced to move to Turkey. That's a different story for a different day, but that obviously changed the flavor of these cities that had been Greek for thousands and thousands of years. Now, beyond the Greekiness of these cities, they had a significant Second Temple Jewish diaspora population. Diaspora in a word, but not really. These Second Temple Jews lived their lives for generations in these cities. They built businesses, were members of the community, spoke and acted Greek, and many didn't even speak Hebrew or Aramaic. Then the Romans come into the show and they ran it. Really. I mean, they didn't directly administer the day-to-day affairs in these cities. The locals did that, but the Romans, they called the shots. They set the vision. They influenced the culture. They dominated the trade. Pergamum was extremely wealthy, even by the wealth standards of these wealthy cities. They had all the Hellenistic values, learning, such as libraries, philosophy, etc., monumental architecture, competitions with the other cities for glory and honor. They were in competition for trade, education, building bigger architecture, building these temples that were dedicated to the Greek and Roman gods, and particularly fighting with the other cities to have more access and more prestige with the cult of the Roman emperors and the deified emperors. Pergamum even invented a new type of writing medium to compete with the papyrus of Egypt. It was called Charta Pergamena, and it would eventually, through changes, sound changes, etc., be called parchment. And this is no small fun fact. Parchment would eventually ultimately win the battle of writing media technology of the ancient world. And it took that from papyrus for a whole bunch of reasons. But this would become what basically people used to write up until paper came in and became the going concern in the Middle Ages, nigh on 1,200 years, 1,300 years after this. Now, Pergamum didn't always control that trade, but it was a big product for them. So enough with that. Let's talk about religion and culture. Pergamum was the location of many cult practices of Greco-Roman paganism. Now, these cities of Asia Minor really quickly became hotbeds for the spread of early Christianity. And I mean really quickly and really early. The apostles moved in, and so did Paul. He wrote many a letter to the cities of Asia Minor. John the Evangelist, the writer of the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, lived in the island of Patmos while he was in exile, and that's just off the coast of Asia Minor. While Christians weren't a huge percentage of the population, the diaspora Jewish population was quite large all across Asia Minor. The distinction between Christian Jew, Jewish Christian, and Christian Jew was hard to tell, especially for an outsider at this earliest time. Jesus, for some, was an add-on to Second Temple Judaism. Some Jews accepted Jesus as a Messiah or the Messiah. Greeks and Romans started adapting Christianity in this time period. Even in the end of the 1st century AD, we're seeing really big moves going on here. This is where two ideas come together. Christianity began to grow amongst diaspora Jews, along with growing in the communities of the Greeks and the Romans, these pagans who were beginning to be called God-fearers. Christianity set roots in the firmly pagan and extremely wealthy and cultured cities of Asia Minor. And this is where we meet Nicolaus of Pergamon, founder of the Nicolaitans. Nicolaus and the Nicolaitans, I'll sometimes lean into calling them the Nicolaitans because it's very easy to switch those, but it is the Nicolaitans. But these Nicolaitans and the followers of Balaam, as they're referred to in the book of Revelation, are often tied together, but they're also treated as separate sects sometimes as well. John the Evangelist does this in the quotes above. They may have been the same sect, or they could have been two different sects with similar ideas, but one of them amongst the Greco-Romans and one of them amongst the Jews. Now, we can see some similarities between that name, Nicolaus, and Balaam. If we break apart the name Nicolaus in Greek, it comes from two words, Nikon, related to the word Nika, which is conquer or victory in Greek, and then Laos, the people. So therefore you have victory of the people. Then you take that word Balaam, Bela, which means conquer in hero, and then Laam, the people in Hebrew, conqueror and the people. That's not likely to be a coincidence. I think that they were not two separate groups, but they were one group that went by two different names depending on the circumstance. Now, there's some debate on who Nicolaus was. Irenaeus of Lyon says that Nicolaus was one of the 7 original deacons, along with St. Stephen, deacon and first martyr. Irenaeus called Nicolaus of Antioch. Now, it isn't impossible that Nicolaus of Pergamum and Nicolaus, one of the first 7 deacons of Nicolaus of Antioch, it's not impossible that they're the same character, but there are some problems. Let's take a look at the pros of this argument that Nicolaus of Pergamum and Nicolaus of Antioch, first deacon of the church, could be the same person. The first 7 deacons were all Greek. Now, Irenaeus was pretty close to the events and was from Smyrna, which was in Asia Minor, very close to Pergamum. Irenaeus was said to have heard Polycarp of Smyrna speak, and Polycarp was said to be very close to John the Evangelist. Irenaeus didn't have exactly firsthand knowledge, but was still 2, maybe 3 steps away from the events. The Nicolaitans went by maybe going by that same, both a Greek and a Hebrew name. The first deacons were likely diaspora, Second Temple Greeks, who, speaking Greeks, acculturated Greeks who were Jews. These people could have very easily have been people who used both Greek and Hebrew versions of their name. Why somebody named Nicolaus would want to be associated with Balaam, that's a different story, but it could very well be that was just a name. Now, there's some cons to Nicolaus being one of the original 7 deacons. There's obviously no direct evidence to support that conclusion. There's no text that said, oh, hey, yeah, Nicolaus of Pergamum was actually one of the original 7. Irenaeus was at least 2 to 3 steps away from direct knowledge of the story. He didn't have a firsthand knowledge. We don't know if he maybe had a text he was going by, or a verbal story, or just an interpretation of text and stories he had heard. So it becomes very difficult to say if somebody so long ago was really, and who was 2 to 3 degrees away from the source, had accurate information. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great podcasts like Mark Vinet's History of North America podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And now a quick word from our sponsors. Then we start asking some questions. Why was the Nicolaitans sect primarily mentioned to be in Pergamum if this Nicolaus was one of the original 7 deacons and was from Antioch? How did Nicolaus get to Pergamum? Was that where he was originally from? Then why say he was from Antioch? Balaam was an evil prophet from the Old Testament and advisor to the king of Moab, who got the Israelites into idolatry and questionable situations with women, sexual immorality. And that's from the book of Numbers. Isn't it just a little coincidental that Nicolaus has that same name in Greek? It kind of works for as a pro and a con that it's Nicolaus and Balaam. It could be in favor of them being one and the same. It could be a con. As we'll see in a moment when we discuss the Nicolaitans' belief, Nicolaus was most likely coming from a Greco-Roman pagan point of worldview and not a Jewish worldview. And I think that will start to build the case that he was not one of the original 7, especially being that those original 7 were Greek, Second Hellenistic, Second Temple Jews. Even a very liberal or open-minded, or maybe not too rigid, depending on what you want to call them, Second Temple Greek Jew would not be as wide open theologically as Nicolaus was. So that gets us to what were the beliefs of the Nicolaitans. Now, there's a caveat here, as we always have to caveat. We don't know what they believe themselves. Only what their detractors, John, author of the book of Revelation, thought about Nicolaus and his followers. Despite that, I think we can see what they likely did believe from the criticisms. The criticisms were certainly polemic, but they do focus on the main points of difference. The main items that the proto-Orthodox bring up is that the Nicolaitans believed in some ideas that, in a way, were pretty close to ancient Christianity, just a little bit askew, if you will, a little off. Irenaeus said they were Gnostics, but Irenaeus saw Gnostics hiding under every bed. Early writers said that the Nicolaitans found a hidden knowledge in Satan. Now, that was probably not in the evil, horned Satan type thing, but maybe in the form of Satan as the adversary, the fallen angel version, the Hasatan version. So not exactly the evil one that we would think of in the modern day, but this other version of the Hasatan angel. Maybe that is possible. A lot of groups around that time did have dualistic tendencies. If you go all the way back in the catalog of the history of the papacy to our series and episodes on Gnosticism, you can see Christianity can tip to dualism pretty easily. And in a lot of ways, Second Temple Judaism can tip to and had a lot of influences from dualism, particularly Zoroastrianism from Persian religion. Now, these early writers said that Nicolaus left his wife, who was extremely attractive, in order to lead an ascetic life. That's good, right? Yes, but again, with some caveats. The caveat is that Nicolaus allowed his wife to be, quote unquote, enjoyed by the members of his sect. Clement of Alexandria, an early church father extraordinaire, a guy with an impervious record, said that the problem wasn't with Nicolaus necessarily, but with his adherents. Nicolaus himself wasn't a bad guy. Others at the time, before and after, they disagreed with that. We've heard this story before with other thought leaders of the early church. The followers run and expand on one or two of the questionable ideas of a person, and that sullies the name of the original thinker. Somebody like Origen of Alexandria comes to mind. A lot of really solid ideas. He was even a martyr, but later people would run with some of his oddball thoughts and ideas, and then so that kind of tarnishes the name of Origen himself, and that happened with others as well. The early writers also say that the Nicolaitans engaged in idolatry. Namely, they didn't have much of a problem sacrificing to the Greco-Roman gods or the deified emperors or anything like that. So the two big charges against the Nicolaitans were they played fast and loose with the sexual morality and making offerings to the Greco-Roman pagan gods. That sounds pretty darn close to what Balaam of the Old Testament was doing. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Now let's dig a little deeper into the whys and the hows of this controversial group and their relationship with the early church. There were a lot of different groups exploring the teachings of Christ and how to implement his teachings in a practical way. One of the first big issues was, should Jesus' message be seen and interpreted purely through a strict Second Temple Jewish lens, or the similar but more open Hellenized Greek Second Temple Jewish lens? Or could Christianity be viewed through a Greco-Roman Gentile lens, really almost completely divorced from its moorings in Second Temple Judaism? So you get a real spectrum of belief here. Peter and Paul, some of the original earliest followers of Christ, they had it out on these issues in their missions. We see it in the letter to the Galatians. Paul had a very different outlook to Peter. Paul's approach is what I might define as the Hellenized Second Temple Jewish approach. Peter's is more of the hardcore Jerusalem, Hebrew-based Second Temple Jewish approach. This all gets hammered out in the Council of Jerusalem. You can see the book of Acts for more details, or the episode number 1E, the Council of Jerusalem, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. The two big items or conclusions of many that come out of the Council of Jerusalem are that there's to be no sexual immorality. The Greeks and the Romans were a lot looser on these sort of things than the Second Temple Jews. And the Greeks and the Romans, the pagans, didn't really understand why the Jews were so hung up on this. I mean, we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans, not a big problem with prostitution, ritualized prostitution. A man could run around on his wife, not a big deal. Very, very loose. Where the Jews, we can look at the Old Testament, we can look at the New Testament, very different idea on those sorts of relationships. The Council of Jerusalem also codified that there would be no sacrificing or eating meat sacrificed to the idols. Eating meat sacrificed to idols was a very big deal to the Romans. That could be a part of the symposium or the banquet after a big civic holiday. You have we're just celebrating as I'm recording this, the 4th of July in the US, and that's a big civic holiday. You have a barbecue. In Roman times and in Greek's paganism, you would have a civic holiday, sacrifice a couple of bulls, and then essentially you would have a barbecue based on that meat. The Jews and then the earliest Christians would say no to that. Also, that's for the higher end people, but the lower end people in society, the lower echelon of income, it's probably more appropriate to say, that was maybe one of their few sources of meat protein in the year was to eat these sacrificed animals. So you're a poor Jew or a poor Christian, you got to say no to maybe one of the few times in an entire year that you would have to getting to eat meat. I won't get into any of the further details of the council, but the council made some major concessions to the Gentile followers of Jesus as well. They didn't have to submit to the entirety of the Mosaic law. That was definitely an issue between the Gentile Christians versus the Jewish Christians. But it was also an issue of Hellenistic Jew versus Israelite, Judean, Jerusalem Jew. These are all ideas we are going to explore in this 10th anniversary series of the history of the papacy. We're going to really dive into a lot of these issues. The Nicolaitans, they sacrificed to idols, they ate sacrificed meat, and they had very different ideas on sexual practices than the strict reading of the outcome of the Council of Jerusalem. There's no doubt in that. Did they have philosophical or theological backing to their ideas? Yes, sure they did. Everyone can find a way to support their ideas. Were they dualistic or Gnostic? Kind of, but in a very different way than other groups of Gnostics. Like I've said, Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, and Christianity often leads to dualism, good versus evil, trying to square the message of the New Testament to the Old Testament. Christianity had to deal with the broken earthly world and the spiritual world. Different groups came up with different answers to these questions. The question of how God could become man in Jesus, despite man being of the corrupt material world, would be a question that would take hundreds of years to answer. In many ways, it's still being debated and struggled with to this day because it is probably the most challenging part of Christianity. Then we get to eating meat sacrificed to idols and sacrificing to idols. In the Greco-Roman world, giving token sacrifice to local gods or to the deified emperors was an incredibly important civic function. I don't think that this can ever be downplayed. It is, in a way, difficult for us to understand today, but I bet you can come up with certain taboos in your own political, social context that if a person chooses not to participate, they would be at the very least seen to be as odd, and depending on how strident the person was about their non-participation, could find his or her way to being completely socially isolated and even outcast from their social network or their social standing. I think of some examples, so this one came to mind. If a person chose not to stand during the national anthem at a sporting event in the United States, really went out of their way that when everybody else, if you're at a football game or whatever, and there's 100,000 people in the audience and 99.999% of the people stand up, and you're the one person who goes out of their way to leave your Buffalo Bills ball cap on, and you're going to remain in your seat, that's a big deal. And you're going to get a reaction out of that crowd. In the same way, it may seem trivial to us to not giving a little pinch of incense to the emperor or doing it, but that carried a huge amount of social obligation back then. The Greco-Roman pagans truly believed that if the gods weren't appeased with these sacrifices, that the fate of the world would be in big trouble. Now, that isn't to say that the relationship Greco-Roman pagans had with their gods were similar to the way the Jews and the Christians interacted with their gods. With their God, a personal relationship with one all-powerful God was foreign, to say the least, to pagans. A more personal, spiritual relationship with God was becoming popular amongst the Greco-Romans because of the lack of personal spirituality within the theology of Greco-Roman paganism. So you had these Greco-Roman pagans becoming Christians and Jewish God-fearers because of the spirituality and the connection to something larger. But that also led to a certain amount of cultural conflict that we will see really played out until Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 and even beyond. Pagan emperors and local authorities demanded sacrifices to the gods occasionally for good fortune, to make up for bad harvests, for good future harvests, to cover over calamities, that sort of thing. For people of any social class, the participation in these pagan rites was obligatory and carried those social issues we talked about if one didn't participate. From slave to artisan to laborer to merchant, all the way up to the most powerful aristocrats in societies. Punishment could be as severe as martyrdom, but there was also the social, political, and economic effects. The Nicolaitans were almost certainly trying to thread the needle, so to speak, with sacrificing and participating in the idolatry. I think they were similar to the lapsed and later persecutions and divisions in the church, such as the Decian persecution and then the Diocletian persecution that led to divisions within Christianity between people who participated in the sacrifices and those who did not, such as the Novatianists and the Donatists. The Nicolaitans likely believed in a dualistic fashion that the sacrifices to the Greco-Roman pagan gods were a worldly thing and were not spiritual. So it wasn't a huge deal to just do a little throwaway sacrifice because it was not a spiritual sacrifice. It was of the world, so it just didn't matter. Also, the Greco-Roman pagan gods weren't real. The God of Israel, the Jesus as God, was real. Essentially, doing a sacrifice to the deified emperor was just doing a sacrifice to nothing. There wasn't any symbolic meaning to it or at all. It was just a physical act of nothingness. The side benefit that was that the Nicolaitans could do the sacrifices and still be in good with the authority, which was a good thing, right? Didn't Jesus say something about Caesar's things and God's things or something to that effect? Maybe by not making us think about the sacrifices, Nicolaitans could make inroads with the pagans too. Like, hey, look, we're cool. We're doing the sacrifices, even though they don't mean anything to us. But why don't you learn a little bit more about our Christianity? At the very least, these people who would do that, like the Nicolaitans, they didn't get persecuted and could keep their businesses and their social standings and pretty much live life to its fullest. Who cares, right? Well, there were people who cared. The proto-Orthodox cared because they didn't see the material world as evil. Jesus became man materially, which made the material world holy. The proto-Orthodox had big enough problems with the Nicolaitans to mention them in the book of Revelation and saying that the whole city of Pergamum's lampstand could get yanked, meaning that the church of Pergamum might not be considered Christian anymore. The proto-Orthodox didn't see sacrifices as just a throwaway to Caesar. They saw them as pure, straight-up idolatry. There wasn't room for debate or for consensus on this one. It was a non-negotiable, as you might say. The proto-Orthodox, like other sects of Judaism, didn't take lightly to idolatry. One other point is worth not making. The Nicolaitans may have considered their sexual promiscuity, sacrificing to idols, and other such abuses, you might say, as a form of asceticism. They were abusing their flesh. Monastics, as we traditionally see them, clearly abuse the flesh. They didn't and don't eat much. Some to extremes. They live in harsh conditions, even as extreme as groups such as the Flagellants in the Middle Ages, who whipped themselves until they bled and were in pain. The Stylites of the Middle East, the monks living on top of columns for years at a time through hurricanes and, well, probably not hurricanes, but extreme weather events. monks living in wilderness for years at a time with minimal subsistence, or living in their cells and never leaving. That is abusing the flesh for ascetic reasons. Could asceticism run the other way if one thought of the world as evil? Meaning eating too extreme, partying, pagan sacrifice to the gods, sexual practices, all of which were very worldly. Could one make a mockery of the evil things by partaking in them? I personally think that's a major stretch, but in a weird way, it could make sense. The early church didn't buy it either, and that is why the Nicolaitans stayed a small sect and didn't influence the formation of the Orthodox mainstream Christianity. They became one of the many groups that stayed isolated and went their own way. There are mentions of Nicolaitans or Nicolaitan-like groups for many years, but the term Nicolaitan may have been given to other groups that were like the Nicolaitans, but not directly related. That definitely happened in later times, particularly in the Protestant Reformation, which they were calling groups Nicolaitan who were clearly not Nicolaitan. They were sort of using it in a metaphorical way. The question of how Christian converts needed to interact with the traditional rules and customs of Second Temple Jewish law, the cultural and religious conflict between Gentile converts and their own societies, and how far people were willing to take adherence to their new religion is a topic that is one of the most important in the study of early Christianity. It's a theme that it will come up time and time again, and it's a theme we will continue to explore in this series. And that's really where we'll leave it off today with the Nicolaitans. We get a little taste of an interesting group in early Christianity that we don't talk much about. These are really the themes I want to get into in this series of the evolution of Second Temple Judaism as it filtered through and developed within a Greek Hellenistic complex, and then the Romans come into the party, and all this cultural mixing of the traditional Jewish religion. And how did these people all get together, and how did they conflict? We will talk more about these issues. So I hope you enjoy, and definitely let me know what you think, or if there's something you would like to say about these issues, because I love to carry on the conversation. As just a little addendum to this episode, I want to give credit to the author of a book I recently read, which gave me the idea for this episode. Professor David A. De Silva is a professor of New Testament, but he wrote a book called A Week in the Life of Ephesus. This Week in a Life of book series is historical fiction written by leading New Testament scholars. These books are part fictional story and part essays on early Christianity. Professor Jim Papandrea, which most of you should know from earlier episodes. If you haven't listened to those episodes, definitely go back and listen to the episodes with Jim Papandrea, because they're some of my most favorite episodes. He wrote what's become one of my favorite books, The Week in the Life of Rome, which is a great book. Professor De Silva, in his book, A Week in the Life of Ephesus, has Nicolaus as a character. Nicolaus drives the conflict in the book. After reading that, I had to learn more about Nicolaus and investigate his story. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I highly suggest you check out the Week in a Life book series. This is not a paid promotion. I just really like the books, and I wanted to share not only the credit for the idea, but also let you know about this great book series. I'd also like to give a shout out of sorts, or more credit, to Professor Adolf von Harnack and his article on the Nicolaitans called The Sect of the Nicolaitans and Nicolaus, the Deacon in Jerusalem, published in the Journal of Religion all the way back in 1923. Von Harnack was one of the biggest early names in studying the history of the Bible and early Christianity. His biography is fascinating, and I went down a mini rabbit hole on von Harnack as a person. You can access this article through the academic journal search engine JSTOR for free. The article is actually enjoyable to read, and it's only a few pages long. It's really perfect reading with a cup of coffee. Again, I would love to discuss this further, so definitely reach out, and I will put a link to the article in the show notes. That's it for this bit of papal and church history. I would love to hear what you would have to say about this episode or any other episode. Join the conversation on social media or email me at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcast or your podcatcher of choice or Spotify or whatever. Most importantly, tell your friends about the History of the Papacy podcast, or even tell a couple of friends. This does more than anything to help me out. Links to all of this and more can be found in the show notes, and I will talk to you next time.